Good evening. I'm Yvonne, Staff for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Number one concern in our time is climate change, which is impacting our entire planet. One of the potential threats of this crisis is mass extinction, usually in our time called the sixth extinction. Tonight we get an update on that possibility, and we learn just how complicated it is to calculate a potential sixth extinction. Our guest is Daniel Rothman, professor of geophysics at MIT and co-director at MIT's Lorenz Center. Dr. Rothman is known for his mathematical analysis of changes in the carbon cycle over the last 540 million years, including the mass extinction, the 5 mass extinction events. We'll learn about some of his other scientific contributions also during the program. But of particular significance for us, Dr. Rothman has identified thresholds of catastrophe in the carbon cycle that, when exceeded, destabilize the Earth's environment so much that mass extinction follows. Dr. Rothman is a fellow of the American Physical Society and the American Geophysical Union, and is a recipient of the 2016 Conant Prize from the American Mathematical Society. It is a great honor to welcome him tonight. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Yvonne.
In the first place, you've looked at 5 mass extinctions in the past. Is there any kind of pattern to this over the period of the Earth's history?
Yes, there is. One of the more interesting things that one can say about mass extinctions is that every time they occur, there's also a significant change in the environment, and that manifests itself as a change in the carbon cycle, and more specifically changes in carbon that's buried in sediment, which is how geologists and geochemists can detect such changes. It turns out that there are also many disruptions of the carbon cycle that occur throughout geologic time. These are sometimes referred to as paleoclimate events, climate changes, but there is not any significant biological or ecological, I would say there's no significant extinction associated with them.
Right.
And so it's interesting to ask what are the differences between these two groups, and it turns out that there are differences.
Okay, on to that directly. Okay. Then what is the pattern, if I may? What is that?
In fact, I may also add that it's not clear whether the carbon cycle disruptions are leading to extinction or if the extinctions are leading to the carbon cycle disruptions.
Okay.
But there's the record is usually, the record is good enough to show a clear association between these two, and sometimes we see that the disruption occurs before the mass extinction. We can talk about that more later, of course. But the principal difference that occurs is the following. We're able to measure how fast the changes in the carbon cycle are occurring, and these can be reasonably considered to be increases in CO2 in the environment, in the atmosphere and oceans. Right. And we can measure how fast that change occurred. And it turns out that in the case of mass extinction, 4 of the 5 great mass extinction events, that rate of change is significantly larger than it is for all other events.
Okay.
Right.
I should have prefaced all this with maybe a reminder of what the carbon cycle itself is, if you would please tell us.
The carbon cycle is actually much like many people have learned when they were grade school students, or at least at their first acquaintance with earth science. Plants take up CO2, and they make what we would refer to as organic matter, or specifically in this case organic carbon. And then the organic carbon is used as a source of energy by consuming organisms, and humans being one of them. And so when consumers consume the organic carbon, it's a process called respiration. The making of organic carbon is called photosynthesis, and there's then a loop. A loop is between photosynthesis, which takes CO2 out of the atmosphere and oceans and makes organic carbon, and respiration, which is basically the totality of processes which reconvert that organic or oxidize the organic matter to CO2.
Okay, so this is a cycle, and it involves, I guess, atmosphere and oceans, and with the plants.
It's a kind of perpetual loop. Plants effectively take CO2 out of the atmosphere and oceans and make the organic matter, and then the CO2 is returned via processes of respiration. And one of the interesting aspects of this loop is that it's not completely closed. As you would think, it's balanced, and it is balanced over very long time scales.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that it takes, in some cases, millions of years for it to finally be closed, because some of the organic matter escapes immediate respiration, it falls down into the ocean, through the ocean, it falls into sediments. Some of it is respired in sediments, some of it even escapes respiration in sediments.
Okay. Now, when you go back in Earth history and look at these extinction moments, then you look at what in science? I mean,
so it's not just that
what's
extinction.
keeping that record?
So let me broaden this to when we look back at disruptions of the carbon cycle. And what we look at is the isotopic composition of carbon which is buried in ancient sediments.
Okay.
So the isotopic composition basically amounts to the relative abundance of the heavier isotope, which is carbon-13, compared to the more common isotope, which is carbon-12.
Okay.
And the important point is to note is that both are stable. Neither decay radioactively, and so they're conserved over time. However, the ratio of those two quantities changes over time, and scientists have developed ways of inferring changes in the carbon cycle from changes in those ratios. So measuring the ratios involves some sophisticated mass spectrometry, which is done by geochemists. Okay. People like me interpret those data.
So you can find these deposits like in rock or in ocean sediments, or
ocean sediments are
right.
a form of rock too.
Yes,
and so,
right.
so the ones that we're interested in are the ones that are in sediments, because they form underneath the ocean, and they record the conditions of seawater at the time.
Okay, so more like those marine sediments that they drill for, that give you a really nice record, I imagine.
Exactly.
Okay, so you can go back and check the record in that way, and you can establish these very pronounced extinctions and roughly how long they last?
So what we establish are pronounced changes in the carbon cycle.
Okay.
So that's a distinct record from the record of biodiversity over time, which allows us to see when extinctions have occurred. In a sense, it's interesting to note that geochemistry, which is what we were talking about earlier, is a kind of modern innovation. It's a sort of late 20th century way of investigating how the environment changed over time. But the understanding of extinctions goes back beginning in the 19th century and earlier. And so the record of extinctions has been clear for some time.
Okay.
And geochemistry has added to that some understanding of how the environment has changed at the same moments.
Okay, and so you can have the demarcation of an extinction period here, one way or the other. There is a record, it's clear, and
changes
so
in
on.
the abundance of fossils and
Yes.
the presence of fossils and the
Okay.
disappearance of fossils tell you when mass extinction occurs.
Okay, and then there's the chemical.
When things are ideal within the same sediments, one finds the chemical traces that tell you how the environment changed at the same time.
Okay, now if we can go to these periods of destabilization, that you had a term for that. So you have a carbon cycle, but you have these distinct periods, thresholds that where things change.
So there are many ways of approaching the problem. Probably the first way to look at it is free of interpretation, and to simply assemble all of the information, the data, specifically, and ask where they lie with respect to one another in terms of their size of the magnitude of the changes, which is essentially the amount by which the ocean's store of carbon changed over time, which is what we can infer from the geologic measurements. And then the rate of change at which the time scale over which the changes occurred. And that's a kind of triumph of modern geochronology, which measures the time it takes for these things to actually change.
Okay.
And so we have on the one hand the magnitude of the changes, which is specifically analyzed in terms of the mass of carbon, how much it changed, and then the time scale over which it changed. So the one divided by the other, the mass divided by the time, gives us a rate of change or a flux.
Okay. In the 5 known extinctions, there was a pattern, presumably, that is, you can tell by the deposits, the marine deposits and so on. And then I want to ask about the present situation, and we are warned that the ocean has, once it reaches the amount of carbon in the ocean, that's this kind of point. And so the IPCC has brought it up, and you have.
So from the data I just discussed, we can see that in the case of 4 of the 5 mass extinction events, the changes were anomalously fast, right? So what we can conclude from that is that mass extinctions as a whole, 4 of the 5, are associated with changes in the carbon cycle that are unusually rapid.
Okay.
So, just to give context, I'll mention these. These are the end Cretaceous extinction, which is the most famous because it's the demise of the dinosaurs, the extinction at the end of the Triassic, the end Permian extinction, which is the most severe of them all, thought to have resulted in greater than 90% of the species going extinct, and the end Ordovician extinction. The exception is the extinction in the late Devonian known as the Franian-Famennian. That has a rather weak carbon signal, and I have no great explanation for why it's so different, but I will also point out that many paleontologists think that the Franian-Famennian event is less of an extinction event and more of a lack of origination, in which new species are not created, and that shows up in the record as appearing to be an extinction. But that's a subject of ongoing.
That's interesting, but the other, you have a clear record where there's the carbon attachment there is important.
Yes, and so now it's been thought for quite a while, I think, in fact, to my knowledge in the modern literature, this goes back to a famous paleontologist named Norman Newell in the 60s, who asked, well, how is the environment associated with mass extinction? So the natural hypothesis to make is that the changes in the environment are sufficiently rapid that ecosystems can't keep up with them. And so a good indicator of environmental change is how the carbon cycle changes, because the carbon cycle is where life interacts with the environment. The two are completely intertwined, and they exhibit their interactions via the carbon cycle, so this is a kind of rough indication of how that interaction is going. And so the changes in the carbon cycle are unusually rapid, so it fits this picture, which I'm dating back to Newell, but has had many, many people have invoked it since, that rapid changes were too rapid for life to keep up with. And so that's sensible, and I have no quibble with it whatsoever. Right? To anticipate where you might be going is that the changes in the carbon cycle today are much more rapid than anything that we've seen in the past. Indeed, the fastest changes in the geologic record are those associated with the end Permian extinction, and the changes in the carbon cycle today are roughly an order of magnitude faster, just very roughly. And so one might be given to thinking, well, the changes today are much, much faster, so the consequences should be much, much worse. And that's an interesting question, and that's one of the questions that I've tried to address.
Yes, and that's one that I'm very interested in as well, right?
Yeah.
But when you say fast, compared
Large
to
amount
previous,
of
time-wise, what are we talking about?
So, thank you for asking. The changes
Like
I
the
was
Permian.
referring to just a few moments ago refer to what we think of as the flux of CO2, the number of gigatons per year at which CO2 is added to the atmosphere and oceans.
Okay.
All right, number of gigatons of carbon.
Right.
Right. And the rate at which CO2 is being added to the atmosphere and oceans today, that flux is much greater. Now, the time scale today is order 100 years. It's more, but let's call it a century.
Right. But since the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, but you know, the major changes are in the last 100 years or so.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so,
right.
but you know, order of magnitude, 100 years. Whereas the changes in the past that I'm referring to play out over time scales of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. And so they are clearly different in the sense they're playing out over a long time scale, and one would like to know how to compare the two rates, because the rates were slower in the past, but their time scales are longer. The rates are faster now, but the time scale is shorter.
Right. And in
all the carbon cycle changes took a long time, tens of thousands of years.
Yeah, and ours is much more abrupt, you're saying.
The changes that we are affecting today is happening over a much shorter length of time. So the atmospheric CO2 changes are growing over a much shorter length of time.
Okay.
Short time scales, it's the amount that changes, and the amount is kind of straightforward to calculate. You can ask how much change occurred over the long time scales at the typical rate at which those changes occur, because there is a typical rate at which at which those changes have occurred. You can multiply that rate times a characteristic time scale of the change, and that gives you a kind of critical mass, and that critical mass is the one that's relevant to the present problem.
That's what we want to get.
Right. Can't emphasize this enough. This work is really of a conceptual nature. The point is that there is a quantity of carbon which, if it's added to the system sufficiently fast, would excite changes in the carbon cycle, which would be equivalent to changes that we've seen over longer time scales in the past.
Exactly. That we're clear on. Yeah. Let's go to your work now. Because you're dealing with very complex phenomena, very interdependent stuff, and not, I think you use the word, this is not linear. It's much more complex. Could you give us an idea of that, and then how you go about looking at it?
So there are many ways to model the carbon cycle and model the climate system. My own work has proceeded in what very well may be the simplest possible way. We don't try to simulate all the processes in the carbon cycle, and indeed we make caricatures of what we think of are essential processes in the carbon cycle, and then we ask qualitative questions about how the carbon cycle behaves. So we ask, under certain kinds of changes, would the carbon cycle potentially become unstable? Yes or no. This type of work gives qualitative understanding of what we call the dynamics of the system, its overall behavior, but it's not so strong at predicting, precise quantities for when certain things will happen and what the precise result will be. It's more about qualitative dynamics, as we say.
Do we say this about, that's one of the things that makes climate research really quite tricky in general, because of this dynamic nature, and that it's really hard to come down.
I would go even further, and I would say it's what makes understanding how the Earth's system works so complicated, and I would say even largely any kind of natural system they're all nonlinear.
Yeah,
and,
okay.
And the question for climate and the question for the Earth system is essentially what are the possible feedbacks which may make our linear assumptions inappropriate.
I'd like to get an idea of how you go at this sort of mathematically in a way that we mortals can understand. You have to come up with a model. The models do exist, but is it quite tricky, or is it straightforward for an expert like yourself to sit down one day and work out a model that seems to capture this dynamism?
The type of models I'm talking about are rather simple.
That's nice to know.
No, they are. I mean, for the cognoscenti out there,
Okay.
they're composed of a couple of differential equations or maybe a few more. And these differential equations contain within them caricatures of processes within the carbon cycle. And then we study how these differential equations behave. And so it requires a certain amount of insight into how the carbon cycle works. It comes from experience. You have to choose what you think is important and what you think is unimportant. And then the mathematics in the end, for people who understand these kinds of things, is actually straightforward. But of course, if you haven't been doing it, then it looks complicated.
Or not acquainted with it. Well, I ask that because in one of the articles about your work, you said, actually, it wasn't such a complicated model, I think. And I thought, I'm going to ask about that because I don't believe that. But in fact, you say it wasn't the mathematics specifically, is that it is this kind of material that you have to work with.
Well, the math isn't complicated, the results are not complicated, and the significance or interpretation is not so complicated. However, the process we study is about as complex as they come.
Okay. There we go.
And so because the carbon cycle is so complex, it is not clear that it makes any sense to make a model of every little critter on the planet and how they behave. And so one has to draw a line somewhere.
Of course,
right?
Of course.
Different people doing different things draw different lines.
That's
and
yes.
all of the possible lines you might draw have value as because they access different types of behavior. So the type of work I've been doing in this problem is the one that basically averages all the whole system to the globe. It considers effects only, for example, in the immediate case of how the shallow ocean behaves. So my interest in mathematizing this process focused on a specific question, or has focused on a specific question. Given the appearance of a critical rate that I mentioned, is that a sign that the carbon cycle can become unstable?
Okay.
And I think that's a genuine scientific question, and I don't think there's a definitive answer to it.
Oh,
I mean, we've made hypotheses, but it's not. And so if the system could become unstable and it could, go off on some serious kind of runaway trajectory, then that has profound implications.
Yes.
And so since we don't know the answer to it, it makes sense to me to make simple models and explore how the system works in that framework.
This is the very nature of the Lorenz Center,
Yes.
isn't it? The sort of work that you do. Backing up just for 1 second,
Sure.
do you need a huge computer network to do this kind of stuff, or do you do a back of an envelope?
Well, it's a combination of pencil and paper and some elementary numerical computing, which if I was good at it, I could code up on my smartphone, but I don't.
Okay, all right.
I do it on a normal computer.
Okay, and back to the kinds of issues. This is a natural for the Lorenz Center, and I would like to know, because I'm not sure that people know much about it. It's very interesting. You've taken up a number of different subjects in that. Could you give us a little background in our remaining time?
So My colleague Carrie Emanuel and I founded the Lorenz Center at MIT around 2011, and what we wanted and do is create an environment for climate science which is curiosity-based. That is an environment in which people can pursue questions like, is the climate system stable? If the climate system is not stable, does it have different equilibrium solutions? And my work on the carbon cycle is one form of that question. And what we do is make a home for people to pursue what they think are interesting fundamental questions about how the climate system works. And it's a privately funded organization. And
one of the things that I'm curious about with the center is, does that, now you and Dr. Emanuel are both very famous people, so if you try a hypothesis and it doesn't work, you're home free anyway, you'll be okay. But a lot of scientists have to worry about this, that in a sense they can't fail, they have to, it has to go straight forward, it has to be okay. Do you have room in the center? I mean, can people experiment a little more?
Oh, no, we have room for good ideas. That's what we promote.
Okay.
All right. And so we're not worried about hypotheses that might be that might not work out. We're much more concerned with people doing interesting work that may have fundamental importance.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Another thing there is that you deal with this very complex phenomena, and so it's not just anything that you deal with, but very complex phenomena, and then, that can make people nervous, I imagine, because it's so difficult to study that stuff.
It's difficult, but it's an important problem.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it's in need of good ideas and basic understanding. We certainly know enough climate science to know that there is a genuine problem that humanity faces today, but we do not understand the climate system not nearly as well as we would like, so that we can improve upon the predictions that we make. And the problem I've been talking about here, we have very few clues as to what the long-term implications of these changes are.
Yes, and I'd like to close on that, because you said, actually, if there's this extinction, if there is a sixth extinction, it will spread out over a long time. Is that correct?
Yes.
And give us an idea there. We'll close with that. How long is that going to take? And given that we seem to be like in the middle of it right now.
So my contribution to this subject, which is the one I feel I'm most able to comment on, concerns the timescale at which the environment may change in unexpected ways. So the focus has naturally been, up until now, on asking questions like this. If we add so much CO2 to the atmosphere, what sort of proportionate response would we expect the climate system and the carbon cycle to display? I've been focusing on responses that are not proportionate. I've been focusing on responses that occur after a threshold is breached. After the threshold is breached, the carbon cycle may go on its own trajectory, and that's what we think of as a nonlinear system. And that trajectory has a long time scale. And I would say that's tens of thousands of years.
For an actual extinction. I can understand that it can go on and on and on.
It's tens of thousands of years for the carbon cycle to go through the sorts of changes which would reach their maximum after 10,000 years. So in the case, I've been basically studying a kind of transient ocean acidification, which is what this is about. And that process would be what humans would think of as slow change, but it would be kind of inexorable. It would just move in a certain direction.
Right.
And that has to do with the long-term evolution of the carbon cycle.
The extinction itself might be much more rapid than the carbon. I understand the carbon issue continues and continues. It doesn't reverse.
So it's an important point to make about my own work, is that it doesn't really speak to the causality of one process with respect to the other. It speaks to their association. And so I cannot say, and in fact I don't know of anybody who could say how long an extinction event would play out if we would have one.
Okay, but we are clear that this carbon thing is going to go on and on and on, it seems like.
Well,
from what
no, we're not clear about that either.
the saturation, once that sets in.
No, I should be clear about what we're not clear about. Right? I've been working with simple models. I've been trying to study the available observational data. There's not that much observational data, and the models are very simple. Right? We don't. The kinds of answers we get, they are definitive with respect to what one sees in a model, right? And they are definitive with respect to what one sees in data, but they're not definitive in respect to what that means for the future, right? I have concluded in some recent papers that a threshold would be passed, which is consistent with catastrophic changes that we've seen in the past. But that's a consistency. It's not a definitive statement.
Okay, that's understandable.
Yeah.
That's understandable. And we will close then with that.
Thank you.
And I hope you'll be continuing on with
Thank
this.
you very
Many
much.
more papers with this sort of thing.
Thanks.
Okay. And thank you for sharing it all with the public.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me.
Pleasure.